The federal government is seeking ways to get the nation out of recession and ensure sustainable growth. One key area that the government is looking at is the management of her foreign and local debt. Federal and state governments are borrowing to fund their budget. But is there any gain in these borrowings? My guest on this week's episode of the program talks about the economic recovery and debt management. Hello there. Thank you for joining me on the program this week. I'm Gloria Umezuki. The federal government is funding a fiscal deficit of 2.36 trillion naira in 2017 by borrowing. Already, 1.841 trillion naira was earmarked for debt services. Now, how can these borrowings contribute to the growth of the nation's economy? I had a conversation with the Director General of the Debt Management Office on how the federal government is managing the nation's debt profile and the economic recovery plan. But up ahead, the federal government has approved the refinancing of $3 billion worth of Treasury bills as part of efforts to restructure the nation's debt profile. Take a listen. As usual, the Federal Executive Council weekly meeting commenced with the arrival of the acting president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo. After the closed-door meeting, the Minister of Finance told State House correspondents that the government is trying to reduce the cost of borrowing, not by dollarizing the economy, but by refinancing up to $3 billion worth of Treasury bills.
As Nigerian government Treasury bills mature, instead of rolling them over, which is what we've been doing, we are now going to pay them off by the proceeds of dollar-denominated bonds, which will be issued. And those bonds are 3-year bonds, whereas the Treasury bills on average are 91 to 364 days. So we're taking short money and refinancing it long. Why? Because every time we roll over, if you borrow with interest and you don't pay back, you roll over, you capitalize the interest, you're actually just increasing your debt. What we're saying is, in the long run, because we're coming into recovery, we need a little bit more time to pay. So instead of saying, okay, we'll pay you back in 91 days, we're saying, let's be realistic, we need 2 to 3 years to pay off this money. So we're taking a dollar-denominated loan, which is cheaper than the Naira loan, and we're refinancing the Treasury bills. We're not dollarizing our economy in any way.
Nigerians should also look forward to a crude oil projection of $2.3 million per barrel at an exchange rate of 305 naira in 2018. The Minister of Budget and National Planning announced this projection as part of highlights in the approved 2017 to 2020 medium-term expenditure framework.
In terms of crude oil production, our estimate projection for next year is 2.3 million barrels per day. We expect it to be broken down as 1.8 million barrels per day with regular crude, and then 500,000 barrels a day in terms of condensate. And the price that we've projected for next year is $45.
So far, the federal government has released a total of 1.3 trillion naira as capital project from the 2017 budget. In our interview, I had a conversation with Mrs. Patience Oniha. She talks about funding the budget through borrowing, sources of strength in Nigeria's debt profile, and the performance of Nigeria's bond in the global market. Mrs. Patience Oniha, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, why do we always have to borrow to fund our budget?
The truth is that government would have an economic plan, okay, and in this case we know about the economic recovery and growth plan, and then there's a medium-term expenditure framework, okay. So essentially those have fiscal targets, meaning the government wants to achieve economic growth of X%, and in each budget to achieve that you include projects and activities that will enable you to achieve it. So let's just say that government's borrowing is driven by government's objective. Okay, so what would you have in a budget? Typically your revenues, and then all those projects and activities that will enable you achieve your economic targets as a government. So where the revenue is less than the expenditure, that gap has to be funded, and that gap is funded essentially by borrowing.
Will there come a time where we would not need to borrow?
I think what will then happen in such cases, but to answer that question, to go back a bit, most countries borrow, and borrowing is not limited only to financing a budget deficit. Sometimes you are borrowing to finance an obligation, in which case it is not like cash is coming to you. You are paying an obligation that you had. So in our case, for instance, we may have a maturity, and then we borrow to finance that maturity. Okay, but put simply, to answer your question simply, if we have plenty revenues and they cover all our expenditures, then maybe that will be the day. But usually in life, whether private or public sector, borrowing is usually a sort of leverage to achieve growth.
You know, because there's been a lot of cries over this particular borrowing, you know, act of Nigeria. That trend really is not favorable to Nigeria in any way right now. And so this leads me to my next question. Nigeria's debt profile standing at 2.3 trillion naira, which is likely to increase according to the Minister of Budget. Can